The rest of it, though, really felt like a good distillation of the whole article.
Hey, Mike, what are we talking about today?
Hey, Francisco. Today, we are comparing 5 different AI tools for summarizing text, and we have a pretty solid lineup of tools, all of which are available for you to hop on and test right after watching this. So we have Quillbot, Sassbook, Paraphrase, OpenAI, and Hypotenuse.ai, all of which are easy to log on to and test. Some of them don't even require accounts. But what we really wanted to do is to see how good these tools are at taking a host of different input material, summarizing it, and regurgitating it back into a way that's easy for a human to understand.
Yeah, awesome. This is the sort of the total opposite of what we did last time because we did text to image generation and now we're doing just text distillation. How did you go about setting up the tests?
Yeah, we did 3 different tests here. So I'll walk you through a little bit of each one and then we'll dive into them in sequence. So we started first with the US Bill of Rights. And one of the things that we were interested in testing here is that, first of all, this is archaic English, so a little bit older, uses words like shall and redress and things like that, Roman numerals, all kinds of crazy things that I'm really excited to see how each of these tools interpreted that and were they able to present back the result in a way that I could understand. And to make it a little bit easier, we'll see this as we go through each one. I color coded each amendment so that we can see how much content is the summary pulling throughout the document. So we'll see this in subsequent tests as well. So that's test number 1. Test number 2 is something much, much more recent. So we have a film review. This is a documentary that just came out last month called Senior, which is about the Downies. So we'll see how it did here. What I liked about this one is that, again, it's modern English and it's also short and sweet. So just 5 paragraphs, and we'll get a good sense of how each model did with this input text. And then third and final is something very academic. So this is the 2018 special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. A great document, lots of amazing content. But, as you'll see here, this is also very academic. There's lots of parentheticals. There's lots of, footnotes and references to tables, and every paragraph is numbered here. So given all this extra content that I wouldn't expect, a robot or a machine to include in a summary, really curious to see how it did here.
So should we look at the first test?
Yes. So starting with the US Bill of Rights, let's see how our first tool did and look at some of the output. So we've got Quillbot here. And right away, what I could see from this output is that Quillbot did not get content from the entire source material. And it seemed to be kind of arbitrary in what it decided was important and what it decided was not. So, it started with the Fourth Amendment. And if you read through, you'll see it's pretty much copy paste from that. But it doesn't get the whole thing. And it just decided to pick 3 other amendments, and there wasn't really any context in terms of what this is. It just sort of lists out bits of part of the document.
Yeah, totally. It seems like it just picked a favorite amendment and a few other friends along with it and just gave you back
Totally.
here's some copy pasted stuff.
And there isn't really rationale for why these ones, and presumably all 10 amendments are pretty important. And you might think that the first 1 or 2 or 3 would be the most important potentially, but it decided to start with 4.
Nice. So
So
Quillbot, not so great.
yeah, I didn't really see much value in this as a usable summary in this
Yeah.
context, but I'm excited to see what number 2 Sassbook did. So let us reveal. And if I stack these next to each other, you can see that Sassbook did even more reducing of content from different amendments. So it decided to pick 3 instead of 4, and it followed a kind of similar pattern. If I zoom in a little bit, you can see that both of these are really kind of regurgitating back out verbatim excerpts from the source material without any kind of you know reframing or distillation of the source material.
Yeah, totally. They seem very similar side by side in terms of if you just like squint at it, it's like they approach it similar. So it makes me wonder whether they were trained in a very similar approach.
Yes. And you bring up a good point that we can talk about later too, because none of these tools are really transparent about their training data. To your point, you can see that they look like they did something very similar, but it's not really clear to the end user when you're just using these tools. Are they using actually the same model, a similar model approach, similar training data? Not a whole lot of answers to those questions.
Yeah. So Quillbook, Sassbook, or Quillbot and Sassbook. Meh.
Yeah, little lackluster thus far. But let's see where we get with Paraphrase. So let's reveal this one. And this one, let's zoom in a little bit here because it's doing some wonky things that Sassbook and Quillbot did not. Um, again, what it did pull in is a similar approach of cherry picking uh, key phrases, key as defined by what it thinks is key, and popping them in here such that if you were to do sort of like a Command F or a search of the source material here, you'd see a lot of the same exact words and phrases verbatim in both. But it was even more confusing in the output in that you can see here it decided to pull in Amendment 3, but then it goes on to talk about a different amendment, and then repeats Amendment 10 three times, somewhat arbitrarily, not really sure what it's going for here.
Yeah, yeah. Um, it's this one seems the least finished out of the three, just because the repeating of the amendment 10 and also like just randomly picking amendment 3 and not really doing much else with it. It just tells you like, hey, these things exist, but like the repeating of amendment 10 just seems a little bit random.
Totally, and it calls into question more than the other ones. And from my perspective, how much can I trust this summary? If I knew nothing
Mm-hmm.
about the source material, I might read this thinking that this excerpt here is Amendment 3, when in fact it is not. So that to me, especially if the stakes are high and I'm trying to glean a sort of gist of information from an important document, that's maybe related to work or some decision that I need to make, I would really think twice about that before trusting one of these tools.
Only twice.
Many times. So I was feeling a little, to be honest, bummed out at this point, and reflecting on the first three. These, in my mind, felt really not ready for prime time and not something that I personally would apply to a work scenario or some decision that I would make. But let's not despair as of yet and go on to our fourth test. So let me zoom into Hypotenuse here. Already you can see, just based on the color coding, is a little bit different in the approach here. And I'll zoom in. We'll maybe show the source material here because you can see right away it's doing something that the first three did not do yet, which is that it's reframing original material with a new output. So each amendment has a title written in Roman numerals, and Hypotenuse sees that, understood it, and regurgitated out. The First Amendment protects religious freedom and the freedom of speech, blah, 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 in a way that the other ones did not. The other ones would have just said, if they mentioned it at all, Amendment I.
Yeah, so we're seeing that the beginnings of actually what it means to summarize, right? Not just like a distillation, but a reframing of and representing of the original content.
Yeah, and this is what I would expect from both a human or a machine that understands the source material and is able to put its own fingerprint on it. This is understanding that not only is it the First Amendment, it is the first in a series of items. So the machine got that and presented that back in a way that immediately builds trust more so than the other ones, which first of all didn't start with the First Amendment. They picked something beyond that, and didn't seem to have the understanding that amendment 4 is not the first thing in a list, or maybe not the most important to start with.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
But the other thing, and then we'll go on to the last one, that this one starts to build a little bit more trust for me, is that there's more content here from the whole document than the other three combined. Really, there's just more trust in this color coding that it's read the whole document and presented back a more holistic summary.
Right, right. It's not just cherry picking randomly spots to tell you about.
Totally. Although I will say it looks like it kind of like gave up after Amendment 6. And it's just like, you know what, these other ones, like, you got enough here. Let's move on.
Yeah, yeah. Cool.
But yes, already a step change more in the sophistication of the output from my perspective.
Cool. Should we check out the last one?
Let's do it. So this one, OpenAI has a couple different models that you can select from when summarizing text. And for this test, I used DaVinci because it's the most recently trained and robust of their models. Although in the next test, I used a different model that is particularly strong in text summarization. So we get a little bit of a flavor of both in these tests.
Cool.
So let us reveal right away. This gave me more of what I was looking for this whole time, which is telling me a little bit more about what is this document that I'm looking at. The other ones jump straight into picking bits from each amendment, and OpenAI does this remarkable thing to say that what you're looking at is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which protect people's rights. So this right away tells me that the training data set is going beyond what's actually in the input material, because there's nothing in here. If you look at what I pasted into it, that says that this is part of the Constitution and that this is just the first 10 amendments. So right away, it's telling me that OpenAI knows more about this document than what's in the document itself.
Yeah, that's really sheds light into what it means to summarize, right? Because the first 3 or 4 of these examples are essentially distilling, which is one form of summarizing. But the thing that we are really interested in is, does it provide additional context to frame and tell us what this thing is about?
Yeah, and it does it in a way that's very succinct. And as you can see here, too, it's taking little bits and pieces of ideas from each of the amendments and putting them together in a novel sentence in a way that the others did not. And it also gives me trust that, it doesn't need to be completely holistic, because, it describes its summary here as, including bits of these amendments, but not saying that this is, represents the entire document as a whole.
And it seems to be the most succinct. Did you? I see in the title here that it says for a second grade student. Was that a constraint that was added, or was just how it's presented?
So I think it's more the latter, in that you can summarize, you can frame the input in OpenAI in a host of different ways, and one of the default templates for summarizing is summarizing for a second grade student. Again, it opens up a lot of questions. I think about, what does that mean? How was the model trained? How does it know what a second grade student's reading comprehension level should be? How uniform is that? Is that a different part of the country, or a different country altogether that a second grade student has? So a lot more questions than answers there. But in short, yes, this is more of just like a default template that I used because as an end user, it was the easiest one to select.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the last thing about OpenAI here is, like, in terms of, like, your color coding that you added, you actually needed to introduce a new way to categorize additions to the summarization, right? Which wasn't accounted for, I guess, originally until you saw it.
The great point, because the other ones, it was really easy to just highlight the ideas that it pulled from the source material because it was more of a copy paste job. Whereas, OpenAI for the first time is adding a new thought in a way that's not expressed in the source material.
Who knew the summarizing could also be addition?
Totally. So important. Context is key. Who knew? All right. So that is test number one. Let's move on to test number two, which is something very different in terms of the date at which the content was created. So, again, this is a movie review, very recent, published in the New York Times just a few days ago as of recording this podcast. So, let's see what Quillbot did here. Right away, you can kind of get a sense for how Quillbot thinks relative to what it's done here and the first one that we showed. It's more of that sort of kind of seemingly arbitrary copy paste job where it's taking most of complete sentences baked in the source material and just recrafting it representing it in its more reductive of formula.
Is it helpful for us to know anything about this movie at all? Is it just a documentary?
It's a documentary. I think what I found interesting in testing this is what I fed into each of these tools. What started here, so it's really just the meat of the article, and I didn't include this summary that the author included at the top. So one of the things I was really interested to see is the output of these tools any better than the output of a summary given as a subtitle to an article?
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's see see the rest of it and see come back to that question.
Totally. All right, let's move on to Sassbook. And again, you can kind of see a similar pattern at play here where it did kind of what it did with the first, with the Bill of Rights, in that it picks ideas that are more complete sentences from the source material and represents it here. But what I thought was interesting in this test that was different from the first one is that, Quillbot and Sassbook were pretty consistent when you look at what they thought was important in the Bill of Rights. But when they were asked to summarize a modern article, they picked very, very different concepts.
Mm.
So, stepping back a little bit, if I was to read Sassbook's summary versus Quillbot's summary, I might have a very different sense of what this film was all about,
Yeah, yeah.
which
It's
doesn't
like,
feel like a good thing for a summary.
yeah. Well, it now feels like you're just playing telephone with a bunch of robots where you're asking like what happened with this movie and each of them tells you their own version, which maybe
Totally.
it's
Yeah,
yeah.
more confusion than insight gleaned, and certainly not a lot of consistency here. All right, so let's go on to Paraphrase. And Paraphrase really kind of did, I guess, as advertised. It seemed to take bits of every paragraph in a way that was surprisingly verbose, given what it did for the Bill of Rights. Although, if you scroll up a little bit, you can see that it is the most verbose with its default settings than these other two out of the gate anyway. But um, at the very least, I appreciated that it covered the whole article and left me feeling like it did indeed consider the whole thing as an input and give me insight about the whole thing, even if it's much longer than the other two.
Well, here just visually looking at the output and the original source material, it seems like Paraphrase is giving you maybe like an 80% of the original text with maybe a lot of uncertainty as to whether or not you're getting value out of it.
And what was interesting to me about this one is that the breadth of the output was way bigger than the breadth of the output for the Bill of Rights, and the source material has way fewer words. So I was left as a user kind of confused as to why is it giving me so much here when it didn't really give me that much here at all. Very surprising, and the output is much more inclusive of the whole document here than it was for the first one. So while I think that I would probably get the most value as a reader and understand the whole entirety of what this film was about or what the review was about, I was left feeling like now I really don't know what to expect from Paraphrase, even if I haven't changed the settings.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You have to use it a bunch more to actually get a feel for it.
Totally. But let's move on to Hypotenuse and see what we did here. So this one was the first one with the Bill of Rights that started to give us a little bit more of its own sort of spin on the document. So I'm curious to see what it did here. And true to form, there was a couple interesting things here than the others. So there's nothing in this review that uses the word eccentric to describe Robert Downey Sr. So this is an idea that Hypotenuse is apparently gleaning from statements throughout the document and adding in here. And I'll be honest, from what I've read of this review and color coding these, eccentric seems like a pretty apt word to describe Robert Downey Sr. But was really interesting to see the AI come to that conclusion. However, one thing that immediately then starts to erode trust is that it describes Robert Downey Sr. as a private joke, typical of the antic artist. So it's like not really describing a human as a private joke calls into question its comprehension of how to build a sentence that makes sense.
Yeah. Like, do you know what a private joke is, or do you know what a person is?
The rest of it, though, really felt like a good distillation of the whole article. So while this statement kind of came out of left field and eroded trust out of the gate, the rest of it felt like a really good summary. And if you zoom out, it also seems to capture ideas from the whole review, which I found much more useful than either Quillbot or Sassbook, which seem to be arbitrarily cherry picking parts
Hmm.
of the article.
Cool. So it seems like the trends is between the first three and the last two are in terms of usability and value.
Yeah, you're
Uh,
starting to see a little bit of a separation from like the real bleeding edge, human readable summaries versus ones that are kind of like more arbitrarily cherry picking content.
yep. Yep. Cool. Let's check out the last one.
Okay, so OpenAI again, and here I used the text query model as opposed to the Da Vinci model just to see, again, because this one is described as particularly strong in summarizing text. I wanted to see, was there any kind of substantive change in the output here? So let's see. Similar to what we got last time, in that there's a couple new ideas that were put into this review, into the summary, I should say, that aren't in the source material. So, this idea that Robert Downey Sr. is an actor is not in any way shown in the review, nor is what he is best known for. So at first I was like, how does it know this? Because it's not anywhere in the input text. And should I trust it? So I went to Google afterwards just to see, was Robert Downey Sr. actually an actor? And sure enough, he was. It's listed as almost sentence number one in his Wikipedia review. So again, it's making me wonder what is in OpenAI's training data such that it
Hmm.
knows things about people, places, things in, human history that are not in the input material that I gave it.
Yeah, it's amazing. Now it makes you wonder, or it makes me, I wonder how you associate your comfort with Wikipedia to the training data that gets fed into these AI systems.
So many questions come out of this, right? Because I now want to know, okay, what also is it reading? Is it reading Wikipedia? Is it reading things that have been, peer reviewed? Is it reading things that are, misinformation campaigns spread by bots?
Right.
The training data is super important into, what a human would, how they would summarize based off of what they have experienced and understood in the course of their life. And similarly, what we feed an AI algorithm to spit back a summary is going to be just as important.
Did you ask the systems to summarize summarize it multiple times? Would you get the same thing, or do you think you would get um, variations, or would you get like the same exact thing?
That's a good question. I actually, in retrospect, I think I only gave it the prompt once.
Hmm.
But because it is generating a sort of novel set of words and phrases here, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw slight variations in the output each time.
Yeah, yeah. And then the last part here, I'm seeing creative deity. Is that in the original source material also?
Yeah, so this one, kind of like how Hypotenuse did some wonkiness with private joke here. This one is interesting because this is a statement pulled from a quote. So the article ends here by Robert Downey Jr. describing his father as having this ability to connect to some sort of creative deity, which as a quote is really interesting and abstract. So for the AI to kind of spit back this kind of matter of factual statement saying that the film focuses on Downey Jr.'s father's decline and death and how he was able to connect with his creative deity makes creative deity kind of feel like a more established phrase than it really is.
Right, right. Yeah. Yeah, so like then there's additional context because of the quotes. So I guess seeing how the systems use quotes and this sort of like out of left field context to summarize.
Totally. And it's funny because it put Putney Swope, the name of this film, in quotes, and I almost would have expected that same kind of treatment for a phrase like creative deity, which came from a quote in the material.
Hmm. Okay. I'm curious to see what it does with the what these systems do with the third source material you provided.
Yeah. So before I move forward, this is the point where I kind of took stock of all the tests that I'd done at this point and the varying quality of what we got. And you can really start to see if you look at, test 2 and test 1 that there's, these three on the top, Quillbook, Sassbook and Paraphrase are kind of in one class, if you will, in terms of what to expect in the output, and Hypotenuse and OpenAI are kind of in another. And I don't have, because the tools themselves don't surface easily in the front end information about what models or methods they use, but you could see a lot of similarity here. And it also made me wonder, is Hypotenuse drawing from OpenAI? Are they using similar technologies and methods, because the output was so similar here and distinct from these first three? So when I moved on to the last one, I was like, you know what? These first three, I think I've seen enough, and let's just go with Hypotenuse and OpenAI to really see what we get here with something a little bit more complex. And the last note I'll have here is there's limits to the free input that you can put into those first three as well. So the number of characters in just this excerpt from this IPCC report was too much to get back, exceeded
Mm.
the limit in what was allowed.
And in terms of in the beginning, I think you mentioned that some of them present themselves to be to for certain use cases. How did that match up to the actual performance?
Yeah, so they talk about in these sort of marketing quotes here that they're used for a host of things, and you can chuck things. I forget which one says specifically. It's great for distilling academic research and papers and things like that. Um, but they're kind of presented as input agnostic. So like chuck text at it, long things, no problem. We'll give you a summary.
Yeah, they don't talk about the quality of the summary. Got it.
Totally. And they
Yeah.
don't set you up to understand, should I expect something different from older English, something that's more complex? Does the comprehension level or the sophistication or lack thereof of the written content change the output?
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like it's still like a in a generalist direction. Um, but I think that's probably from an expectation of wanting to create general AI versus the reality of having AI systems that specialize with different types of text, language nuances, and domain concepts. Right.
And I will say though that in those first two tests, I got a little bit more confidence, that OpenAI in particular and Hypotenuse might be more able to handle a broader variety of inputs than the other three that seem to be tripped up with things like lists and cherry picking content almost arbitrarily. seemingly
Yeah.
arbitrarily as an end user.
Cool. Let's look at the last test then.
Okay. So just to give you a sense of what's in here, we've got a lot of academic speak here and things that are useful for academics to understand things like, the level of confidence for a statement, references to figures, all sorts of other, the numbering of the paragraphs themselves, so you can copy paste them in other places. But things that I would expect to be very advanced for an AI to understand and parse out to give me just the gist of what I'm reading here. Let us take a look at what Hypotenuse made of this. What we can see here is that it did a pretty good job, I think, and kind of piggybacked on what it sort of led me to expect of its output in terms of style and length, by giving me summarization from throughout the document. Although there are bits that both models missed in terms of the meaty middle of the document. It does start with a kind of summarizing sentence that human activities have caused approximately 1 degree Celsius of global warming above pre-industrial levels, and goes on to give me more flavor that comes from the rest of the material.
I see that you also highlighted will persist.
Yes, and I did that because the interpretation of each of these tools, it's kind of like a foreshadow of our next reveal, was a little bit different, and I think was one of the takeaways that I got from using both of these tools, that interpretation of factual information in scientific literature can be a little bit fraught, especially if the summarizer is putting their own spin or interpretation on the source material. So I underlined will here because, will is a statement that is consistent with the source material, and that, this statement, anthropogenic emissions from the pre-industrial period to the present, will persist for centuries. If you look at the same part that was highlighted in the source material, you can see that word will here. So that is a consistent interpretation with what I'm seeing in the input material. However, it's a great segue to our last one. I went back to DaVinci for OpenAI models to read this one, and let's just go straight to that blue highlighted area. The word could have long lasting effects was quite interesting to me because will is pretty definitive in the source material, and also something that Hypotenuse borrowed verbatim. But OpenAI uses the word could, which to me changes the meaning pretty substantially. It also kind of diminishes almost the sense that the statement being made in the source material is definitive. But a couple other things here that, again, are kind of consistent with what we've seen from OpenAI is this addition of a context setting intro sentence or statement. So,
Yeah.
global warming is when the temperature of the Earth's surface gets hotter. That's actually not mentioned at all in the source material, but in OpenAI fashion, it knows more seemingly than what is in the source material that you feed it.
And I wonder how much of that is with the framing of summarizing for a second grade student. Because if I think back to like the first sentence of the Bill of Rights example and this one, these are like two critical sentences to help someone understand and frame what it is that you're talking about.
Yeah, it's that kind of context setting intro that makes everything that follows it a little bit more like, now I have a frame through which to understand the rest of the summary.
What are some of the other sections you highlighted with the triangles and underlines there?
Yeah, so I put the triangles here to signify deltas that, to me, OpenAI is making a statement that calls into question, is this actually a statement that is consistent with the interpretation or the intended interpretation of the source material? So for this, the statement that's in green here, this would cause climate related risks for animals and people. If you go to the section highlighted in green in the source material, this makes it a pretty bold statement, pretty clear statement that impacts on natural and human systems from global warming have already been observed with high confidence. So if I go to if I go to what OpenAI is saying here, um, this would cause climate related risks for animals and people and could have long lasting effects, really diminishes the 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 clarity and confidence that comes through in the source material. So to me, I was really kind of blown away by that.
I wonder if it's mixing uh, parts of the report that are reporting on things that have happened and projecting and forecasting. So it's mashing those two things and then it's averaging out what between what has happened and what could happen into these fuzzy prediction words.
Just as if I was talking with someone that has a wide breadth of people that they draw influence from, this to me feels kind of like a diplomatic statement that's almost saying, well, some people might say that this would cause climate related risks to animals and people, and others might say more definitively that it wouldn't. But that's not what the source material says that I input into it. So it really makes me wonder again, where is that? What is in the training data that OpenAI is using to interpret what I gave it and spit back a summary?
One of the takeaways here in terms of future use cases is distinguishing between summarizing what the text is doing versus the recommendations and forecasting as a thing that you're asking the system to do.
Yes, and transparency too. I mean, it was one thing that felt missing from all of these tools in terms of some way to communicate with ease to the end user. What is the method by which I, as the robot here, am using to craft this, and where is my knowledge coming from? This last bit here, I highlighted or underscored here to prevent this from happening. People are doing things like reducing emissions and adapting to these changes. This prevent this from happening was also a statement that seemed a little bit of a interpretive ad lib from OpenAI here that wasn't mentioned in the source material. So while the source material does make it very clear in this statement that adaptation and mitigation are already occurring with high confidence, there isn't a statement that says, adaptation and mitigation are occurring in a way that will prevent this all from happening. So,
Mm.
again, I kind of left with a very different vibe from Hypotenuse and OpenAI, with OpenAI making me feel after reading this that, you know, hey, this is happening, but there's could go either way. This could, and there's a lot of people doing things to prevent this from happening, but that's again not what I'm seeing
hmm
in the source material.
So one thing that I'm looking at the last two test cases, actually no, between the Bill of Rights and also this last example, seeing when the system's injecting something that adds value versus when it's injecting something that calls into question whether they're overinterpreting into a wrong direction.
Mm-hmm.
Because with the Bill of Rights, right, the first sentence was great context, but then when it starts over evaluating or over interpreting what the source material is, that's when it feels like it's veering into the wrong direction.
And it really makes me wonder too. I think it's all well and good when the stakes are low, but as these models get increasingly good at presenting information back in a way that's easy for a human to understand, I could see in more and more cases people relying on the interpretation of the model to tell you, what this larger long form document that you might not have the time to read means. And that's to
hmm
me where it gets a little bit more fraught in terms of to what extent do I just take the machine's word for it?
So now that we've seen like these three tests, what are some of the the things you start thinking about at this point?
Yeah, I mean, this opens up like we saw with text to image, so many possibilities. I think particularly by the likes of output that we see in tools like Hypotenuse and OpenAI. Um, I don't know about you, but I feel like a good chunk of my day every day in the workplace is reading. there is so much content to consume and only so many hours in the day. And I think more and more, you know, I need to be judicious about what I take the time to read in detail. And I could see so much potential for tools like this to take, a long form document or research that I've collected and summarize it to give me and others the gist of the takeaway here.
Yeah. With the movie review, how was the summary compared to the author's blurb that they included in the article?
Oh, great question. Yeah, so the summary that you can see here, this documentary highlights Robert Downey Sr.'s charisma and curiosity, even when it shows him in decline. Each one of these, got different bits and pieces of it. Strong production hand and on-screen performance from Robert Downey Jr. Again, it's more of like it's not really about what the film is, but more of just like, yeah, sure, okay, he was involved in strong production. It seems like what the author is trying to communicate is more about what is the film actually about. And I think that each one of these kind of got missed the mark, at least for the first two, in a way that gives you, uh, you know, with the same brevity, a similar takeaway. I think that Hypotenuse and OpenAI got much, much closer. If you look at OpenAI's, it's talking about the film focusing on Downey Jr.'s father's decline and death and how he was able to connect with, that oddly phrased, a creative deity. This, though, is getting more, I think, at the type of intent that the author had
Mhm.
in expressing what the film is about.
Yeah, with the use going, I know we're jumping back to the use cases at work. Is uh, being able to like summarize and distill, which I feel like I already do in a lot of my work. Is that here's a report, and then here's like the TLDR of the stuff that I'm trying to say. So seeing that at work would be interesting. Would you use this for any of your qualitative research work?
I think when I was thinking about how I could apply this to qualitative, OpenAI is pretty flexible in terms of ways that you can adapt its model to give you different to look for different things in the source material. So I think that there's a lot of possibility for, say, give me a host, given a host of transcripts, pull out key words and phrases, or summarize the gist of what I'm seeing from maybe 3 or 5 interview participants. I think another great potential could be, after say I'm at the wrapping up a study and I've talked, to a handful of participants, and I just want to capture the gist for someone that might come after and be interested in what was covered in this study, to be able to
Mm,
have that kind of exec summary crafted without, again, having to spend time, thought, and effort and energy to write it myself. But that would only be if I could really trust the machine to be true to the intent that I, as the researcher, had. And that's when I really kind of had to kind of stop and take pause of how OpenAI and Hypotenuse, um, well, OpenAI in particular, but to a lesser extent, Hypotenuse, put its own interpretation that could actually change the meaning of the source data.
yeah, because I think, as you were saying with the qualitative stuff, maybe it doesn't make sense to use it to synthesize your interviews and the feedback from participants, but maybe it makes sense to summarize your work, which you have a better sense of, right? So, because if you're asking to distill the participant stuff, it might still not know what's interesting or relevant because it might need context as to like what you're trying to do, what's interesting, what you know already versus what you don't know. But to summarize a report that you have, you know what it could be or what it should be to down to its essence.
That's a great point. I feel like if I was trying to implement something like this in either a work context or something that I was producing, I have that ability as the original author or researcher to verify the summary that the machine is giving me and use that as kind of like a way to sort of leapfrog the draft one and maybe just revise and edit down its summary a little bit if it tweaked something here or there that I took issue with. Um, but yeah, for reading now a summary that it produced from someone else's work, I would really I feel at this point like none of these have earned my trust to take it at face value without verifying a little further or double checking.
It's almost as if you need a review or ranking system of summarized items to see where you can place your trust um, in them.
Totally. Who can you trust? Humans or robots?
uh, One thing, maybe this is idea for future episodes, which is I love to get into, is being able to synthesize sentiment from documents or from essentially text, which I don't think these necessarily get into or explicit about. But besides, here's what it's saying. Here's like the intent or sentiment about the text, right? For like the review, right? Is it a positive or negative review? Just directionally, and then that'd be like a separate type of summarization.
Oh yeah, yeah. I could see so many applications there for things like interpreting, net promoter score, things like survey data. If there's any kind of open ended question or long form question and answer data that comes back, to be able to interpret that and present back to the researcher. Given so many things that you likely don't have the time to read and interpret and aggregate, here's a distillation of that.
Cool. So if you were to summarize, Mike, for other people, the state of AI system summarization skills, what would you tell someone?
I would say that from these tests, it feels like there is a lot of variability in the field out there right now, and that you really kind of have to dive in and explore to see a little bit more, to get a feel for how a particular algorithm is going to take your input and give you output. Because as you can see here with all of these tests, that output is very not uniform from tool to tool. Each one seems to have its own personality and capability, and the only way to really sort of learn that is to start that dialogue and learn a little bit more of what to expect from each one.
And do these present themselves as like enterprise tools in any way? It sounds like they would, right? Like I'm not sure there's like a consumer use case that they're aiming for. Is that right?
That's a good question because I'd say Quillbot, Sassbook, and Paraphrase feel a little bit more like they are not enterprise tools and more things for like an individual writer to sort of log into, or even in some cases there aren't even authentication barriers where you can just go to a Quillbot and copy paste in data without having to log in or create an account. Hypotenuse felt like it was a little bit different because there is a set of documentation around an API that you can have access to, and there's a little bit more of a sort of slant for a business to business kind of relationship there. And then OpenAI feels like it has that, and even further, a little bit more of a skew towards developers that are looking to build tools on top of these capabilities.
Would be interesting to see how people start using these, and whether you will eventually see AI systems that specialize in different types of summarization, right? Because I imagine there's probably something really powerful for like legal document summarization. Maybe like the risks are way higher, but it maybe also helps you sift through a larger volume of research or like preliminary research and discovery work that legal folks need to do.
I think we heard a simultaneous shudder from any and every lawyer that might be listening to this podcast.
The level of risk, right? Because then is the liability on the legal team using the system or on the system that's summarizing these things for them?
Ooh, that sounds like questions for future lawyers to wrestle with.
Yeah, totally. Cool. All right. So this was our second episode. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you all later.
See you later.